Herbert Marx created a company called the Marman Products, which produced and sold motorcycles between 1948 and 1949. In World War II, the company also manufactured a whole bunch of stuff, including the Marman clamp, which was used to secure some cargo, like when you fly stuff. It's got that car over there. It was actually what held the atomic bomb on the Enola Gay, and it's actually still used today on spacecraft. Also, Herbert invented a vapor delivery heating pad and a wristwatch that was a cardiac heart rate monitor that alerted the user to an irregular heartbeat. If that sounds like an early version of the iWatch or the Fitbit that monitors your biometrics, it was, and it was invented by our intrepid Herbert in the 1950s. Elizabeth Marshall, a scientist herself, wrote this in 2024. Marx's contribution to the field of medical technology had a lasting impact on both innovation and patient care, while his wristwatch with a heart monitor and heating pad may not have reached widespread production. Its concepts and principles laid the foundation for future advancements in wearable health technology. And the article ends with this comment: the wristwatch with a heart monitor and heating pad exemplifies Marx's commitment to using technology for the betterment of humanity, leaving a legacy that continues to inspire innovators today. All right, now you would think at this point I was going to talk about how history has forgotten this medical research pioneer whose work has been overshadowed, overlooked, or just forgotten, even though it was brilliant at the time, but that's not what we are here for. We are here to look aghast at people who have been remembered for the wrong reasons. You do know Herbert Marx, but not because he set in motion improvements in medical technology that still inspires researchers today. You know him by the name Zeppo, the fourth of the comic team of Marx Brothers, who made the films like Duck Soup and Monkey Business and Horse Feathers. He was not Karl Marx's brother. He was Groucho Marx's brother. Even his own family kind of looked at him as second fiddle. His second wife left him for Frank Sinatra, although frankly, that was mostly his fault. Anyway, if he's remembered at all, it's mostly as the straight man to Groucho or just as the least funny Marx brother. That is some fate, huh? You come up with an iWatch 70 years ahead of its time, but all that anybody can remember you for is beating Groucho Marx straight lines. That is a sad historical fate, but how about this? You single-handedly saved the United States from financial ruin and are more responsible than anyone else for the creation of the United States Constitution, and all that anybody remembers you for is losing a pistol match with Aaron Burr. Today, we will dive into what Alexander Hamilton should be remembered for, but isn't, and we enter the world of high finance on this episode of Theater, History, and Mysteries.
I'm John Brushke, and you are listening to Theater, History, and Mysteries, where I take a musical theater production, go into a deep dive on the questions it raises and the answers it provides. I hope that this approach will give a deeper understanding about the lessons that the musical has for theater and for life, and I will never miss an opportunity to pursue any mystery, bizarre coincidence, improbable event, or supernatural suggestion along the way because, in the words of Dirk Gently, it is all connected.
All right, before I say anything else, once again, I just feel like I have to say this every time, but thank you so much for listening to these episodes and for taking this journey into Hamilton with me. I know every podcaster says it, but if you could help us out by spreading the word, spreading the episode, posting an episode you like, dropping a tidbit, having somebody pointing this show in the direction of somebody else, that really, really will make a difference. The podcast is doing pretty well. We gotta keep growing, and what you do is really going to make a huge difference in that. And if you are enjoying this and you're looking for something to binge, like maybe we got a long car ride coming up, or maybe you're just parked indefinitely on the 405 freeway in Los Angeles, if either of those are your situation and you want some more content or just something you can kind of sit back and listen to me tell you about, we have past episodes on Phantom of the Opera, Man of La Mancha, Cats, Jesus Christ Superstar. Check those out, and honestly, you help the show as much by listening to the back episodes as to saying subscribed. Okay, today we are going to talk about Alexander Hamilton's role in U.S. banking. Does that sound Boring. Well, kind of Lin-Manuel Miranda's whole thing was he took what seemed like boring historical topics and made a fantastic musical out of it. Maybe I can do the same thing with this podcast. The thing you ought to remember Alexander Hamilton for is not that he had an affair. I mean, that's not, you don't need to forget that. Just like, don't think making the first thing you think about. Not that he got shot in a duel or that his son died in a duel. What you should be thinking when you're like, Alexander Hamilton, what did that guy do? What makes him stand out in history? Why is he remembered well enough that they could write a new history about him and that Lin-Manuel Miranda could know about it and pick it up and make an entire musical based on it? What did he do? Well, that guy was a banker. He formed, I think it's called the Bank of New York, but it's the longest continuously running bank in the United States. But way more than that, he founded the U.S. Treasury and the U.S. National Bank. Okay, so let's just start by asking, what does the musical have to say about that compromise, the room that it happened, and Alexander Hamilton's role in banks? Okay, I just want to start by saying, seriously, what is it you actually know about Alexander Hamilton? If you were listening, I hope you have seen that show like 50 times. I hope you go whenever you can. I hope you stayed up till midnight, as my daughter did, the day that Disney let it drop during the pandemic, and you watched it and that you have memorized the soundtrack, because this trivia question is for you. What do you know about Alexander Hamilton now that you have watched the show and memorized the soundtrack? Well, you know for sure he was an immigrant. You know that he was an aide to Washington. You know that he did stuff in the Revolution. You know that he fought for something in a cabinet meeting. He had an affair. His son died in a duel, and then he died in a duel. The cabinet meeting, that thing that we just kind of brushed past, that's what I want to focus on. Right now, if you had to write an essay and put in as much detail as you could, what do you know about Alexander Hamilton's role in those rap battle cabinet meetings? What was it that he was for, that Aaron Burr couldn't quite say that he was for, and that Thomas Jefferson was adamantly opposed to? What do you know? Well, the song where all that happens is, of course, called The Room Where It Happens, and most of that is actually sung by the character Aaron Burr. There's stuff in there about Mercer Street. There's stuff about Jefferson setting the meeting. They say stuff about the room where it happened a lot, like the phrase, the room where it happened. You know, that's a song about the room where it happened. And frankly, it is a great song. All in all, it's like 5 minutes long. They say the room where it happened a lot. But there are 5 lines, only 5 lines I could find that address the substance of the meeting. And they go like this. I'm not going to try to wrap it. Otherwise, the internet can and should delete this video. Here's the line. The immigrant emerges with unprecedented financial power, a system he can shape however he wants. The Virginians emerge with the nation's capital, and here's the piece de resistance. No one else was in the room where it happened. Burr is mad that Washington wasn't involved, although he's really mad, of course, that he wasn't involved. And he's unhappy that New York City got sold down the river. And later on, the lyrics go this way. When you got skin in the game, you stay in the game, but you don't get a win unless you play the game. Oh, you got love for it. You get hate for it. You get nothing if you aren't in the room where it happens. That's like a 5-minute song. There was a compromise reached there, and it was in those lyrics. What was that compromise? Was it General Mercer and having a street named after him? Was it an immigrant that got unprecedented financial power? What financial power did he get? What was he able to do? Why did he get it? Did Alexander Hamilton give more than he got? What did he give? What did he get back? If you can answer those questions, I am in awe of you. But I don't think you got it out of the show because I don't really talk about that. What actually happened was that was the key to the formation of the U.S. Central Bank and Alexander Hamilton's financial plan. So what actually happened in the room where it happened? Okay, what happened in the room where it happened was eventually what would get called the Compromise of 1790, but there was a lot more to it than just a bunch of guys got together in a room, they made a deal, they struck a deal, and then it came out of that, and one guy had a ton of power. There was a lot of stuff that had to happen before it, and a lot of stuff that happened to happen after it, and a lot of current debate about how important it really was to everything. Okay, so here's the background. In January of 1790, so it's the Compromise of 1790, the meeting happens in June, but in January, Alexander Hamilton, the Constitution has created a new government. So we had the Articles of Confederation, we had Confederated government. The Constitution establishes a new government. Washington is now its president, and Hamilton is its Secretary of the Treasury. Thomas Jefferson, by the way, is the Secretary of State. So for the first time ever, the Secretary of the Treasury is standing in front of the U.S. Congress and giving a series of reports about what's going on. Now, I just want to say, I go to a lot of boring faculty meetings, and they have impressive sounding things like the Academic Senate. And boy, do we spend a lot of our time listening to reports, which are supposed to have something interesting about them, but God knows what they do. If you had insomnia, I will shoot me an email at the theaterhistorymysteries@gmail.com email address, and I will send you the video recordings of the meetings where we listen to the financial reports. It is not that big a deal. But when Hamilton did it, no one had ever done it before. And here's another fascinating thing. There is a good argument that the French Revolution was started by the financial reports. It was somebody standing up and talking about the finances of the government for the first time. Now, this wasn't going to be quite that big a deal, but it was definitely going to have a huge impact on the way the whole nation got shaped after that. The Secretary of the Treasury of the United States is standing up, and he's giving an address to Congress about what he thinks, what is our financial situation, and what do we got to do about it. That report happens in January, and what followed was not everybody was like, way to go, Alexander. We see where you're going with this, and we're behind it. There's actually a huge north-south split, and it's just beginning to emerge. Now, the North is, of course, more industrial. They produce finished products, and in doing so, they're actually competing with Britain as their number one competitor. And the South is, of course, mostly agrarian, but most of the war debt is actually held by the North. So banking is a bigger deal in the North than in the South. And when loans are taken out and financial transactions happen, those happen in the North. And the Northern colonies just generally borrowed more to support the war. So there is debt that needs to be paid. And that debt was held by the states when the Revolutionary War was fought, because it's true that the war was fought in 1776, and the Declaration of Independence happened in 1776, and that was a great big deal, but we were just kind of a great big army led by George Washington at the time. The United States was not yet a firmly established federal government. So debts were being incurred, but who owed those debts and who was going to pay them off? Like if the state of New York incurred a debt, fighting a war for what would become a federal government that did not yet exist. And New York said, we don't want to pay those debts anymore. Would the federal government pick them up? Would New York still be on the hook for it? And from the Northern perspective, why is it we should be paying back all of these war debts when we took those out to win the war for all of us? That was sort of the opinion in the North. And the South was, of course, saying, well, yeah, but they're your debts. Why should we be paying off your debts? Okay. That's a big unanswered question. Alexander Hamilton's answer is this new federal government should take on all the war debts for all the states. We will take those on, and we're going to fix them. Now, obviously, they would need a way to do this, and establishing a bank and establishing a strong federal government that could tax people and raise money was a big deal to Hamilton. And Hamilton was, of course, an author, along with James Madison and John Jay, of the Federalist Papers. Okay, so going into the Constitutional Convention, they had to sell a strong federal government. And the leading voice for that was Alexander Hamilton. So when he's coming out as the Secretary of the Treasury, he's like, we need a big government. We need a big bank. That government has to be powerful enough to fight its own wars, and it has to be strong enough to raise its own money. And that includes taxing people. But he could not get Congress to pass the legislation that would make that happen. And he knew it. And then at the same time, and this is more of a sideshow, but it's not clear where the U.S. Capitol should be. Where are we going to put the Capitol? And there's like 12 different suggestions out there, but there isn't really a front runner. If Philadelphia gets to host for a while, that's a good choice, but maybe New York is a more obvious choice. Nothing is resolved. And the country's got to figure those two things out. Okay. So on June 20th of 1790, Thomas Jefferson is the Secretary of State, and he hosts a dinner with James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. Madison, and they did have a dinner conversation about all these things. I'm going to read you the account of what happened in that meeting, because you would think, listening to a song which keeps saying nobody knows what happens in the room where it happened, There would be no account of what happened in that room, but there is. I'm going to share that with you in a little bit. But essentially, the deal that is struck is Madison is going to talk his people into getting votes for Alexander Hamilton's proposal for the national government to take on the debt. It's called assumption. Assume the debts. And in return, the capital is going to be Philadelphia for a while, but then it's going to move to Washington, D.C., which is on the Potomac, and it's closer to Virginia. That is the crux of the deal that is struck in the room where this happens. Congress passed the Residence Act in July, which established the permanent capital in what would become Washington, D.C., and the very next month, Congress passed the Funding Act, which included the assumption of the state's debts. The deal, which was definitely discussed in Thomas Jefferson's dining room on June 20th, would result in two pieces of legislation that would get passed the next summer. There is now no dispute that this meeting took place, but some historians have now become skeptical about how big a deal was it to that compromise that was eventually reached. Now, what's interesting is there is a surviving document that accounts for what happened in the room where it happened. This is the account, and it's written by Thomas Jefferson. Now, he actually has this account in a couple different places, and they're slightly different. The one I'm going to read, there's a citation that I'm going to leave. It's actually from the U.S. National Archives, but it's obviously they have reproduced the document. I didn't actually get to go to the archives, doggone it, but they have reproduced it. It's online. I'm going to give you the link. You can take a look at it. This is Thomas Jefferson's account. What I'm going to do is I will read Thomas Jefferson's very 18th century sounding prose, and then I'm going to interpret it into what that actually means. Here we go. Remember, the word assumption here is used to mean that the federal government will assume the state's debts. The assumption of the state debts in 1790 was a supplementary measure in Hamilton's fiscal system. When attempted in the House of Representatives, it failed. This threw Hamilton himself and a number of members into deep dismay. Going to the president's one day, I met Hamilton as I approached the door. He was somber, haggard, and dejected beyond description, even his dress uncouth and neglected. Okay, let's interpret. What does that mean? I saw Alexander Hamilton, and he looked like hell because he was trying to get the U.S. federal government to assume the state debts, and he took that to the House of Representatives, and it had failed. It was not working. Jefferson continues that as to his own part, if he had not credit enough to carry such a measure as that, he could be of no use and was determined to resign. Okay, and that was Hamilton saying, this is my baby. If I can't get this passed, I'm gonna quit. Okay, but in swoops Thomas Jefferson, peacemaker, and he says, it was a real fact that the eastern and southern members, South Carolina, however, was with the former, had got into the most extreme ill humor with one another. This broke out on every question with almost alarming heat. The bitterest animosity seemed to be engendered, and though they met every day, little or nothing could have been done from mutual distrust and antipathy. Geez, I'm glad that doesn't happen in the U.S. Congress anymore. We don't have two polarized sides that fight so much they can't seem to agree on anything. But there's Thomas Jefferson saying it was happening. It was happening right there in 1790, the advent of the country. All right, so what is your boy Thomas Jefferson going to do about that? Quote, I thought the first step towards some conciliation of views would be to bring Mr. Madison and Colonel Hamilton to a friendly discussion of the subject. I immediately wrote to each to come and dine with me the next day, mentioning that we should be alone, that the object was to find some temperament for the present fervor, and that I was persuaded that men of sound heads and honest views needed nothing more than explanation and mutual understanding to enable them to unite in some measure which might enable us to get along. Okay, let's interpret that. Jefferson says, yeah, there were those freaks out there. They're having their fights. But I, Thomas Jefferson, thought, if only we could get reasonable people in the room, we could talk through our issues and we could resolve them. And then he reports what the deal was. This is Jefferson again. The removal to Potomac could not be carried unless Pennsylvania could be engaged in it. This Hamilton took on himself, and chiefly, as I understood, through the agency of Robert M. Morris obtained the vote of that state on agreeing to an intermediate residence at Philadelphia. This is the real history of the assumption about which many erroneous conjectures have been published. Okay, Jefferson is saying a lot in there. He is saying that you got to have Pennsylvania to vote for it if you want to have the nation's capital to be in Washington, D.C. on the Potomac, because they want it to be in Pennsylvania or in Philadelphia, which is, of course, in Pennsylvania. But Hamilton said, I'm going to get Pennsylvania to back your place for the capital. In exchange, I want you, Madison, to get the votes for my central bank to be created and for my economic program to go through. And here I'm saying, so that kind of ends where Jefferson in this note talks about what he thought the deal was and what it would accomplish. He's now talking about what he thinks about it in retrospect, and it changes that abruptly in what Jefferson is writing, which is why it's going to change super abruptly for us. Quote, it was unjust, in itself oppressive to the states, and was acquiesced in merely from a fear of disunion while our government was still and in its most infant state. It enabled Hamilton so to strengthen himself by corrupt services to many that he could afterwards carry his bank scheme and every measure he proposed in defiance of all opposition. In fact, it was a principal ground whereon was reared upon that speculating phalanx in and out of Congress, which has since been able to give laws and to change the political complexion of the government of the United States. That is Thomas Jefferson saying that he got hoodwinked by Alexander Hamilton, that he gave up way more than he got. All right, what do we make of all that? Well, as you could probably tell from my sarcastic tone, I have read more than one author who thinks that Jefferson's account is a little self-serving. In Jefferson's account, everybody else is a hot-headed freak. He, in good faith, brings Alexander Hamilton and James Madison together so that they can negotiate a good deal. He himself has no part of the room where it happened. He didn't even really get the issues. He just thought it was important that you get smart people together and that if they could be reasonable, they could come up with a solution. And he didn't really understand what that solution was. But when Hamilton got his teeth into it and got the legislation passed, well, then he went rogue and created this huge national government that Jefferson thought was a bad idea. Okay, I'm going to now read a quote from the PBS American Experience series. They don't have an author for it, but they've definitely got some big-time scholars who do their stuff for them. Here's their take on it. Quote, though historians have judged Jefferson's account of the now legendary dinner table bargain to be largely truthful, it has self-serving aspects and does not present the whole picture. Far from being dreamt up on a single evening, the contours of the compromise were being negotiated before June 20th. A number of meetings had been held between various interested parties, and Jefferson himself had participated in at least one of them. In addition, by the time of the dinner, Madison already had the votes he needed to win on the capital issue, though Hamilton did smooth the bill's passage. What Virginia really got out of the evening, and Jefferson's account omits, was a $1.5 million lowering of her tax obligations under the Assumption Plan, at the time a considerable sum. It was a concession that Hamilton was happy to make since it enabled him to win the larger Assumption battle. Federal financial policy would be shaped by his vision, not that of Virginia farmers, and in time, Jefferson would come to denounce the dinner bargain, claiming that Hamilton had duped him into it. End quote. Is Thomas Jefferson kind of trying to weasel out of his own role in the compromise, that he had played a bigger role in it than was possible? And if you think about it, like, okay, so by Jefferson's account, Madison has already got the votes. He doesn't have to give up anything. And what Hamilton is offering is, I will give you $1.5 million in 1790 money. I'll take that debt off of you. It sounds like on its face, right? Hamilton's giving up a bunch, and Madison doesn't have to give up anything. So for Jefferson to come back later and say, ooh, Hamilton tricked us both, maybe not. But here's what we can say about this. The musical probably oversells the extent to which that room where it happened was a backroom deal that left a whole bunch of people out, including Burr himself and George Washington. It's also not true that Aaron Burr was stalking up and down outside the door, feeling bitter that he was left out of it. This is probably not what made Burr so salty. And it's also the case that there had been big debates in Congress before this. In January, there had been Hamilton's presentation. Then there was legislation that got shot down in the House of Representatives. Then the meeting happened, it's true, but then two separate pieces of legislation passed, which were talked about in that meeting. That meeting definitely probably contributed to it, or at least what ended up happening was what they had talked about in the meeting. But it is, most historians now will not draw a straight line between that meeting and everything that happened. Isn't it weird that the account about the room where it happened that is in the show Hamilton, that is written by Lin-Manuel Miranda, who's definitely on the pro-Hamilton side of things, is actually talking about a viewpoint that was advanced by Thomas Jefferson, saying that that was, this weird room that had happened. Okay, so all that means that we do kind of know what happened in the room where it happened. But it is Jefferson's own version, so we also kind of don't really know what happened in the room where it happened, but not more or less than we know or don't know about any other historical event. That makes this meeting a great dramatic choice, and it's a great song, but it's not necessarily great history. There was a compromise. It probably did favor Hamilton, at least by the end, but it was out in the open. Or at least whatever was discussed at that dinner was also later discussed in the open, where anyone could have talked about it or argued against it. They just got beat in a debate on the floors of Congress. It still needed multiple votes in Congress. It did not have Aaron Burr outside the door. It was Jefferson who did not invite Burr, not Hamilton who left him out. And Jefferson did have Burr as his own vice president in the future. So if Burr was complaining that, oh my gosh, Jefferson did stuff and he never included me, well, Hamilton was never a part of Jefferson's cabinet, but Burr definitely was. Okay, so now the compromises happened and Hamilton gets his bank. Why is that such a big deal? Okay, well, a little bit of historical context here, but it is maybe the biggest deal in American history. In 1776, two important things happen. The United States declares independence from Britain, starting the Revolutionary War, but also a Scottish scholar, economist named Adam Smith, publishes a book that is called The Wealth of Nations. Now, here I'm going to be relying heavily on Nicholas Carrot of Ball State and Loris White of George Mason University. They were writing in 2019 and in the Southern Economic Journal. So here's the big picture is that Adam Smith is the economist. He is Scottish. He is in favor of free trade. He wants very few legal restrictions on the banks. And Hamilton and Jefferson each liked Smith, and they wanted parts of what he had to say, but for different reasons. Here's a quote. Thomas Jefferson, while Secretary of the State, wrote to Thomas Manning Randolph on May 30th of 1790. And here's what he wrote. In political economy, I think Smith's Wealth of Nations the best book extant, end quote. And Alexander Hamilton drew on the Wealth of Nations while he was drafting his most important documents, including, most notably, his report on manufacturers and his report on the National Bank. Hamilton actually made 5 different addresses to Congress. One of them was that report on manufacturers, and the other was the report on the National Bank, which both of those preceded the Compromise of 1790. Okay, so let's start with Adam Smith. He's the scholar that everybody's reading at that time, and he's got a new and exciting approach. Smith is free trade, and here's the quote from that article. Smith stressed the economic benefits to the public that emerge unintentionally from freedom of trade and industry. Under social institutions of private property, contract, and consent, Smith argued that the price system guides self-interested individuals to benefit their fellow men. You have also probably heard the phrase invisible hand. That is also Adam Smith, and it came out of that book. So Smith is in favor of free trade. That's kind of just his thing. At the time, there was a separate group that are called mercantilists. Mercantilists want to restrict free trade so that domestic industry can develop without being crushed by, say, the United Kingdom, because the United Kingdom was this huge empire. The United States was still a small, fledgling economy trying to get off the ground. And mercantilists were people who were in favor of manufacture and commerce, and they wanted the manufacturing operations in the North to be protected against having to compete with British. They also, this is all kind of linked to the gold standard, so I'm going to read another quote. Such mercantilist ideas confuse the stock of specie with the real wealth of nations, which is the annual volume of consumable goods and services. Okay, so the Adam Smith's point kind of is wealth isn't the amount of gold you have sitting in a bank somewhere, it is the amount of goods and services that you have circulating through their economy. Specie, the stock of specie means the amount of gold. Specie is like a tangible thing. So what Smith wants is for banks to issue paper notes. That is, take this note. It's worth £5. If you come to our bank, we'll give you the money. And he wants that because it speeds up commercial activity and gets access to more credit. Wealth is goods and services. And he thinks that there are built-in mechanisms, that invisible hand, that will stop banks from overextending. And he's also got some specific regulations like usury, So he doesn't think credit is unlimited or that it's always a good thing. And he also thinks it's a bad idea to loan out too much, but he thinks mostly works. And his example is the Bank of Scotland. Now, there's some debate about whether or not Adam Smith thought the Great Britain National Bank, the British National Bank, was also a good idea. He used the phrase great, but, kind of in the same way you might say the great white whale. That just means it's big, not necessarily you think it's a good idea. The authors that I cited definitely think that it's not. Curot and Wright definitely thinks that Adam Smith isn't necessarily a fan of the British National Bank and that his ideas are based on Scottish National Bank. It's a big debate, not one that is super relevant to us, but we can say that Adam Smith is not a fan of central banking. Here's the quote, "It is clear that Smith generally supported free trade in banking, and his views stand starkly opposed to central banking as the term is understood today," end quote. What Adam Smith wants is a bunch of smaller banks that are governed by the invisible hand of the free market, and he thinks that is the key to prosperity. That is Smith's view. Hamilton, who, as we know, likes Smith, has this take on it. Now, his entry into the whole dispute starts in 1781. So this is before he is the Secretary of the Treasury. He's only in his 20s, and he recommends Robert Morris to be the Superintendent of Finance for the United States, and he wants a national bank. But he's also a Federalist, he's also an elitist, and he also wants central control. We'll talk about the elitist thing a lot in coming episodes and a little more later. If that term makes you think, wait, that's not the guy I'm cheering for in the musical. Yeah, me either. But that might be the guy that we got. Anyway, here's the quote from Karl and White. Quote, "Using an approach that he would repeat in his later report on manufactures, Hamilton begins with a positive allusion to Smithian ideas, then subtly shifts to disagreement and ends with an outright rejection of Smith's policy advice," end quote. He is thinking bigger than Scotland. Here's the quote on that. Hamilton says, quote, "They have successfully obtained in Italy, Germany, Holland, England, and France, as well as the United States," end quote. Smith is thinking about the National Bank of Scotland, but Hamilton is thinking about all the national banks that he can point to in the world. And in fact, when he got around to writing his own charter in his report on the banking in the United States, the thing that he cites the most is the charter of the Bank of England. He thinks that English king sucks and we should throw tea in the harbor, but by God, they've got a good idea about banking. He likes the uses of credit, but he also thinks that having this big central bank would help the government, the federal government, be able to borrow the money it needed, and it would also make it easier for the government, the federal government, to impose taxes. Two more quotes. Quote, "While he agreed with Smith that commercial banking enhances a nation's wealth, he rejected Smith's theoretical and historical cases that the freer and more general the competition, the greater the enhancement," end quote. And finally, quote, "While he agreed with Smith that commercial banking enhances a nation's wealth, he rejected Smith's theoretical and historical cases that freer and more general the competition, the greater the enhancement," end quote. Adam Smith wants a bunch of small, decentralized little banks because, among other things, if they fail, that's not such a big deal. But what Hamilton wants is a big, strong central bank so that it could support a big, strong central federal government, and that is 100% consistent with what he had just been arguing about in those Federalist Papers. That wraps up what we have to think about what Hamilton wanted. Smith wanted a bunch of small little banks. Hamilton wanted one big bank. Thomas Jefferson wanted no banks whatsoever. Or at least not a central bank, or at least not even a chartered national bank. He was opposed to the big federal government that Alexander Hamilton wanted, and he wanted decentralization in all things, then including the banking system. And so the range of options are Smith wants a bunch of small banks, Hamilton wants one big bank, and Jefferson doesn't want any banks. That then was the position that was taken to the debates that would subsequently happen in Congress. And those were big debates. Here's the quote from Karl and White. Quote, "The congressional debate over the bank bill crystallized the two-party system," end quote. If you're wondering where a two-party system started, it was right in this debate about that central bank, that there were people who had fought for a new federal government or a new United States government opposed to the British, and there were lots of opinions. But those opinions splintered into two different opinions, the mercantilists and the anti-mercantilists, and the North versus the South, and the big bank versus no bank, and that all happened when it was Jefferson and Hamilton fighting about the central bank. And Hamilton won that, and part of that was in the Compromise of 1790. Jefferson managed to persuade Madison in those debates, who also didn't like big banks. He also got Attorney General Edmund Rudolph, who thought it was unconstitutional. And he got John Adams, who just hated banks. Here's the quote from John Adams, quote, "Our whole banking system I ever abhorred, I continue to abhor, and I shall die abhorring," end quote. All right, that's a lot for your boy Alexander Hamilton to have to go up against. Madison used to be his buddy, but now he's opposed. Thomas Jefferson is also opposed. The Attorney General is opposed, and John Adams is opposed. John Adams just hates banks. But the legislation comes to Congress. The Senate passes it by an oral vote, but we actually don't know who voted for it and against it. An oral vote is where you just say ayes and nays. The chair listens to it, and if it sounds louder on one side, they call that side the winner. So it's not clear of those people in the Senate which ones voted for and which ones voted against Hamilton and his central bank. But when it gets to the House, it passes 39-20. Now that's kind of a landslide. That's 2-1 margin, but only 6 members of the South vote for it. Washington doesn't want to sign it because, he's got his attorney general telling him it's unconstitutional. Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Constitution, is calling it unconstitutional. But eventually, Hamilton rebuts all that, makes speeches countering those arguments. And they are based on what is now the famous implied powers doctrine, that the federal government, to accomplish its ends, must have the powers to be able to do so. Those powers are implied. That is now a core part of constitutional law, and it is what Hamilton successfully convinces Washington of, and Washington gets to sign it. So it ends with Alexander Hamilton gets his bank, and he uses it to solve the debt crisis. The United States has a huge debt problem, but they have a Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, who's got ideas. He got those ideas implemented. He convinced Washington to sign it. He overcame his opposition, and now he's got a central bank. And so now this is what he does with that is what's got Thomas Jefferson so salty. So we have one last topic, and that is we need to talk about mercantilism and the North versus the South. What Alexander Hamilton wanted was economic growth. That was pretty much his deal because he thought that was what would make the United States the strongest nation it could. Now, let's just take a moment and think about the composition of those founders. Almost every other one was from some state. So if you would say, I am for the United States, but I'm also from a Virginian, or I'm from the United States, but I'm also a Georgian, or I'm from the United States, but I'm also from New York, right? And I started identifying with my state. Not so Alexander Hamilton. He grew up on that tiny little island that got destroyed by a hurricane, and he came to the United States. He just wants the United States to be strong, and he doesn't have the state allegiances that most or almost all of the other founders do. Okay, so he's just consumed by the question, what will make the United States stronger? And for him, the answer is economic growth. This is a quote from Amir Phillips, who is from Lincoln University. He was writing in the year 2025. And I got to say, however much you think you like Alexander Hamilton, Amir Phillips might have you beat. There's a little acknowledgement section of all academic articles where you get to thank your advisor or your students or your pets or your family or something. And Amir Phillips thanked Alexander Hamilton himself, who wasn't really in a position to appreciate the shout out, having been dead. But here is his take on Alexander Hamilton. Quote, "The pith and marrow of the body politic is not consumption or even individual well-being in terms of hedonistic utils or even incessantly elevated standards of living, but rather surefire production and national greatness and power to render a modicum of security in the fallen world." Hamilton believed this with all of his being, that production and power through state-sponsored institutions are how all great nations were created. End quote. The reason Hamilton wanted his bank and his economic program and solving the debt crisis and creating economic growth is because he thought that was the only way a strong state could be created. And you had to have a strong state to survive in the world where other states were going to attack you. Now, Phillips also thinks that the really big issue that started here was the North versus the South. Tariffs, which Hamilton was in favor of, that was the mercantilist agenda, always helped the North. They always hosed the South, and that this was the true source of the Jefferson-Hamilton split. His quote is, quote, "The mercantile Hamilton protectionism, and the yeoman Jefferson free trade would do opposite things, end quote. And this kind of crystallized in their positions about the war between France and England. We had, of course, just won our independence from England. France had just murdered its king and was on its way to appointing Napoleon, but there was a French revolutionary government that was at odds with the British, and they were fighting each other in the very late 1790s, the last couple of years of that century, and just into the 1800s. And so the question now was, what was the United States going to do about it? Well, Hamilton came up with the idea that we should trade with England, because they were the key trading partner, not France. That was going to be profitable for us, and that's where we could become a stronger nation by becoming more economically viable. Jefferson and Hamilton were like, what the hell are you talking about? We just fought our independence from Britain, and France backed us. We have got to back France. Jefferson and Madison put legislation forward to support France and tube England, but Hamilton successfully killed those measures in the Senate. Here's Phillips, quote, Hamilton's view won out and dominated the U.S. approach. Hamilton won that fight, and then he won the war for the next entire century. Here is how Phillips traces it out. Hamilton's view won out and dominated the U.S. approach. Economists Daniel Raymond and Henry Charles Carey under the American system, and then adopted Hamilton's views, and politically became the core policies of the Whig Party of Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, subsequently inherited and fully implemented by the Republican Party from Lincoln onwards till at least 1932. But to be clear, this socio-economic process began via economic national ideas of Hamilton, and particularly his congressional report on manufacturers, end quote. What was the reason the United States became the dominant economic power in the world? It was Hamilton's ideas, and those started in that report on manufacturers that he gave to the United States Congress, and that traced through all those political parties we don't even know the names of anymore and sound funny to us now. They all adopted his ideas. They carried them through American history, and they trace back to Alexander Hamilton, at least in the view of Amir Phillips. And this all happened despite the best efforts of Jefferson and Madison, quote, yet Jefferson and Madison had successfully precluded a systematic program of federal government support for manufacturing. Due to this, the perception over the generations is that Hamilton's famous report on manufacturers was never implemented. While in the particulars, this is substantially true. The fact that nearly all of the suggestions of ad valorem changes were appropriated directly from the report on manufacturers. And finally, Phillips' summary, quote, were also built up and supported by federal, not state revenues. The mercantile policies of the Federalist administration were dominated by Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton, who developed a mercantilist philosophy to guide his activities as secretary. His outlook was aristocratic rather than democratic, capitalistic rather than agrarian, mercantilist rather than laissez-faire. His whole program was dedicated to the achievement of a strong government that would be closely allied with merchant and financial groups, end quote. Okay, now in there you probably heard that he was elitist, and he was mercantilist rather than laissez-faire, and aristocratic rather than capitalist. We are going to talk a lot more about whether or not that was really the true Alexander Hamilton in future episodes, but for right now, let's just notice that Amir Phillips, literally the biggest fan of Alexander Hamilton, the historical figure, not the musical, the historical figure that you could possibly have, he's the guy saying that he was elitist, he was aristocratic, and he was mercantilist and anti-capitalist. That's kind of the Alexander Hamilton that is the actual guy, and we'll talk about the implications of that a little bit later on. Anyway, Hamilton went for it, and it worked because it was mercantilist. So here's the final quote from Phillips. Quote, specifically, Hamilton modernized the 18th century mercantilist thesis, and like other mercantilists before him, emphasis added, Hamilton identified national power with the development of manufactures. And, quote, I have used the phrase mercantilist maybe 50 times in the last 5 minutes. Dude was a mercantilist. He did it. It worked. It made the United States an economic powerhouse. Now, let's shift a little bit and just say, what do other people think about it? If that's what Phillips thinks, that's what Kieran and Wright think. Do other people think, well, here's what we got so far. Hamilton was a mercantilist. Jefferson and Madison were agrarians, and that was a big deal, and it shaped all American politics for a century because Hamilton won, and he won for the North. That contributed to U.S. economic development, which is what made the United States an international powerhouse and provided us with our security and the greatness of our current country. So I'm now going to read you a quote from Salzman. It's a little bit striking, so just bear with me. Now, Salzman is also a Hamilton lover. He thinks that Hamilton is not recognized as being an economic genius when he should be. But here we go. Here's the quote. You ready? Quote, Hamilton's policies were not mercantilist, end quote. That is a curious position to take. Now, it is kind of tricky. What he eventually says is that Hamilton did not want the United States in the international mercantilist system because he thought we would lose to Great Britain if that happened. He did want to have domestic mercantilism where the manufacturing centers in the North would get protected with tariffs, even if that pitted him against Jefferson and the South. Okay, but there are, I guess, viewpoints out there that Hamilton, but let's just remember that Hamilton is remembered as the mercantilist. Everybody thinks he was a mercantilist. There are voices who say that he was not, and that maybe he was just a really nuanced thinker who couldn't be shoved into different categories. One of the people who really does not like Alexander Hamilton is Nancy Eisenberg. She wrote in 2017. She's a professor of history at Louisiana State University, LSU. Now, she's also a scholar of Jefferson and Madison and Burr. So, all the people that hated Hamilton's guts is what she'd sort of invested her career in. But I do think she's kind of got a point here. And her concern is with factory labor. It goes like this, quote, I strongly urge all, that means us, right? You and I today, to revisit Hamilton's report on manufacture, 1791. Remember, that's the one that Phillips thinks you can trace all of American economic success to, in which the Treasury Secretary was quite clear that the classes to be exploited at factory workers were women and children, even children of a tender age. Why? Because they were idle and contributed nothing of value to the economy. So yes, Hamilton did anticipate a modern industrial economy, but it was built on the backs of poor women and children. I ask again, what could possibly be less progressive than advocating child labor? This is why the 18th century Hamilton cannot be dragged into the 21st century without recognizing how much unpleasant baggage he carries. End quote. All right. Eisenberg, no fan of Hamilton, and hence no fan of the show. Remember that what Lin-Manuel Miranda is trying to do is take this figure who existed in history and move him into the 21st century, retell his story to make those ideas in his life relevant to us now. And Eisenberg is saying, can't do that. Elitist aristocrat, pro-factory, not a progressive. All right, but let's separate that out. Child labor, yeah, that's bad, but let's not pretend that wasn't happening in the South either, right? It wasn't like you had a farm and so there wasn't child labor there. It was not the case that I think Hamilton was the only person advocating child labor, or had his program lost out and Jefferson and Madison won, there wouldn't have been child labor. And the labor of women, women had a long uphill fight to be included as productive members of the workforce. That fight is not over, right? And we have not achieved equality in the workplace right here in 2026. But there's Alexander Hamilton in 1790 saying women should be workers in factories. Now, if you think that working in the factory is the equivalent of slave labor, maybe that's not progress. But if you're in 1790 and the options available to women are you could be married, kind of end of story, advocating that women should be a member of the workforce is maybe not as anti-progressive as Eisenberg imagines. Let's also remember that the Industrial Revolution kind of traces to 1750. And by 1860, it's obviously got some problems. We are writing books like Les Miserables, about how bad things are. And we're Charles Dickens is writing about Oliver Twist. And there's clearly some problems with the Industrial Revolution that are evident in 1850. But in 1750, it is not nearly as obvious. And let's just remember that when Victor Hugo is writing Les Miserables, and he talks about the factories, when he's talking about what Jean Valjean does, Jean Valjean is the good factory owner. There are some bad ones for sure, but that factory and factory work is not necessarily an inherent wrong. And in fact, one of the things that Jean Valjean does to help women is give them employment in his factories to give them economic opportunities they would not other have. So, does Nancy Eisenberg have a point about Hamilton's championing of manufacturing not necessarily being as progressive as it seems? Yes, she may be mixing too much child labor and the employment of women, and maybe taking a 21st century, 2026 view of what we now know the Industrial Revolution would become and faulting Hamilton for not predicting it. Yeah, I think that we will discuss in coming episodes, I promise, the problematic nature of some of the stuff that Alexander Hamilton definitely did, and especially his elitism, especially him being an aristocrat, and ugly things about slavery and immigration. All of that we will get to. But I'm not sure it's fair to completely dismiss him just because he gave a speech that was in favor of the employment of women and children in factories. I don't think that was especially nefarious at the time, and I do think it was, if not, it was motivated by a true desire by Hamilton to try to make the United States great. Okay, so now we're done. What do we make of all of that? Boy, that's a lot. History, banking, room where it happened, compromise of 1790. Well, Saltzman makes the excellent point that ideologues of today will try to make Hamilton into a caricature. And if you like capitalism, you try to make him your pure hero. And if you hate capitalism, then he's your arch villain. Here's how Saltzman puts it, quote, "If America becomes the world's dominant capitalist dynamo, credit Hamilton, unless you're an anti-capitalist, because he was truly the most pro-capitalist founder. If instead America became illiberal, politically centralized, bureaucratically bloated, crony-ridden, and financially fragile, unjustified blame is heaped upon Hamilton because he established a strong, energetic federal government, true, compared with its predecessor. Let's not split the difference between the false extremes," end quote. What Saltzman then believes Saltzman is doing, and I'm not sure Saltzman did this, but says, let's just take a sober look at the guy. Let's not push him and caricature and make him a caricature one way or another. Did he make the United States great? Yes. Did he get his bank? Yes. Did he solve the national debt? Yes. Were there problems that stem from that? Yes. Was he an elitist? Of course. Did he want the central bank because he wanted a strong central government and he didn't trust the masses? Also, yes. What he was complex and varied. It's definitely not an easy hero or villain who can just be dropped into contemporary political debate. We have already heard Philip's summary where he says that Hamilton was aristocratic, capitalist, and mercantilist. Here is Saltzman's summary. Quote, "Hamilton was no mere economist. He was a political economist, and rarer still, a pro-capitalist, and not an original economic theorist. Nonetheless, he was an astute synthesizer of principles and policies, and correct ones. His unique combination of talents marks him as the original practitioner of wise economic financial policymaking. Alexander Hamilton is both. He is a mix, and he's not a caricature. He was a pragmatist that could make things work." Saltzman thinks that Hamilton's great accomplishment is that he was right. He was, and that is no small feat. He wanted to make the USA the biggest, baddest nation state in the world, and he did. Now, he probably didn't see, and he probably didn't care enough about what that would do to people at the margins. But what Saltzman says is there's a lot of people that have had ideas about what will make nations great, and frequently they're wrong. Most of the time they're wrong. The number of people in the French Revolution who thought they could fix the French economy and did not is enormous. Hamilton, for whatever else is true about him, he might have been right and his choice have been an unethical or immoral one, and there might have been something better out there. But what he said, he was right about, and most people in history can't pull that off. And he pulled it off in a way he wanted to make the USA great, and he really did. So what is it we should be remembering Alexander Hamilton for? Well, according to Saltzman, and I'm going to give him the last word, quote, "As Treasury Secretary from 1789 to 1795, that's only 6 years, by the way, Hamilton almost single-handedly fixed America's shattered financial system," end quote. And hey, that is a lot. That's a lot for anyone to accomplish. It's a lot for anyone to accomplish in 6 years, and it's a lot for anyone to accomplish in a 47-year-old lifespan. Okay, but we're not here to talk about history only. We're here to talk about the musical. What does all this say about the musical? Well, remember that Miranda is trying to reimagine Hamilton and see how he'd fit in today. Now that is cool, and that is an artistic choice. I want to take a look back at this Hamilton and figure out the parts of his life that I think speak to the world we are in today. But the real Hamilton was not a power to the people guy. He was a pro-bank guy. He really, really wanted a strong federal government. But if you are a, President Trump all the way, I'm an anti-regulation fan, and I want to eliminate climate protection, I got to say, Hamilton still sounds like the kind of dude who is too pragmatic for you. There's this great quote about Hamilton and his genius, and where people say, hey, Alexander, how do you do it? You're a genius. He's like, look, man, I sit down with the books, I read everything, I see what's right, I see what's wrong, and then I try to move forward on the basis of that. I don't know. It is true that Alexander Hamilton established the U.S. banking system, and it is true that fueled the Industrial Revolution and led to some absolutely horrible abuses. And Karl Marx, not Herbert, Karl Marx was right to critique all of that. And I believe a lot of what Marx had to say, a lot more than my friends on the right do. But I think he was enough of a pragmatist that if he were alive today, Hamilton would have said, I am now interested in keeping the U.S. as the greatest power on earth. What do we need to do? And I think he would have looked at the climate change data and said, we are not burning more fossil fuels, or we have to make a transition. I think he would have looked at artificial intelligence and said, these data centers are bad news and the technology doesn't work. And I do want a big federal government, but by God, I put my life on the line at Yorktown. It was not so we could have artificial intelligence surveilling the entire United States population. I think that he was too much of a pragmatist and too much of a independent thinker to say, I am just go big government, go more capitalism, pro-business all the way. I think he would, of course, correct it. But however he is remembered, what should Alexander Hamilton be remembered for? Well, probably for saving the United States economy and setting it on an economic course that over the next century would make the United States a global powerhouse and maybe the most powerful nation state that has ever existed. And that's probably a more important thing than remembering him for losing a duel to Aaron Burr. Okay, so just, one kind of little closing note here. Zeppo Marx is often just said, who is just the straight man for Groucho Marx. I've seen other people who try to say, yeah, but he had this one scene, the letter writing scene in that movie with Groucho where he held his own. That proves that Zeppo was, in fact, had great comic potential in him. He just kind of got overshadowed by Groucho Marx most of the time. I'm downloading that. I'm going to put that little outro here. You can listen to that episode. I don't hear Zeppo Marx doing a whole lot of anything there. Maybe if Zeppo Marx is not remembered for his medical discoveries and medical contributions, he is not wrongly remembered for being the least funny of the Marx brothers. Anyway, we should all be so lucky. At the end of your life, how you remembered? Well, I was the fourth funniest Marx brother, but I created a bunch of important wristwatch things and medical technology. I guess that's a little bit better than what is your history? I saved the United States economy, but people just remember me for losing a duel to Aaron Burr. Well, that's how it goes on America. If you are history, we don't always remember the most important things about people, but by God, I think we can try to remember them a little bit more accurately. At least that's what we're going to try to do on this podcast. Okay, we have now learned about the room where it happened. In our next episode, we are going to talk about the famous duel in the musical. Of course, Alexander Hamilton does kind of throw away his shot, and there's a reason that they duel, and there's a cause behind the outcome. We'll take a look at the historical record and see how much of that is what really happened on the next episode of Theater, History, and Mysteries.